MFA in the School of Visual Arts. Her Beautiful Boys series, which is the subject of tonight's event, has been exhibited individually 7 times since 2017 in venues such as the Newport Art Museum in Rhode Island and the Clark Gallery in Massachusetts. Since 2016, Rivera has also curated and produced 9 exhibitions, including Ligne Infini, Theater of Desire from 1930 to 1990, which was the first survey on Fini presented in the United States, Night Fever, New York Disco from 1977 to 79, and Marriott Pethy Allen, Rites of Passage, among others. Her many honors and awards include the Magnum Photography Award for her Beautiful Boys series, the People's Choice Award winner at the Filter Photo Festival in Chicago, and the Griffin Museum's Peter Urban Legacy Award. In 2019, Dickinson College students participating in the Trout Gallery Student Purchase Program traveled to New York City for the annual photo show and chose 2 photographs by Lissa Rivera for the Trout Gallery permanent collection. Since then, the photographs have been used in outreach programming and with Dickinson College classes visiting the Trout Gallery, garnering high praise for their ability to support nuanced discussions of gender and representation. One of these photographs is currently on display in the Trout Gallery's exhibition entitled In Light of the Past, Experiencing Photography from 1839 to 2021, of which I was one of the senior art history co-curators. And I can say that in the 2 times that I've visited the exhibition, each time I've been struck by how much attention her photo draws, even when surrounded by the entire history of photography as best we can present it. Rivera has also said that her work is about, quote, identity and relationship to the history of photography, end quote. Our other guest tonight, BJ Lillis, is certainly attuned to that fact. Besides being Rivera's muse and romantic partner, BJ is currently a doctoral candidate in American history at Princeton University, with his research focusing on the colonization of the Hudson Valley and the complex cultural and economic relationships that it entails. BJ has also previously worked in public history at the Museum of the City of New York, including as the project assistant for New York at its core, a groundbreaking 3-gallery permanent exhibition of the past, present, and future of New York City. Altogether, his research interests include the history of gender, sexuality, the family, African diaspora history, Native studies, and comparative colonialism. So please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers, Lissa Rivera and BJ Lillis.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Are you able to see our slide okay? Amazing. And you can hear us all right? Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I deeply appreciate this, especially it's just nice to connect to people as we're all separated and isolated. So this is wonderful. It's great to meet you. So let me, won't change slides. I guess I just click on it. Okay. So I often start with my childhood or our childhoods because when speaking to students, I always find it more like it's easier to connect if you talk about like where you came from and where you started and mistakes you made instead of just showing like a final end product. So I actually started out by really hating photography a lot. I was my father's test subject for his photo equipment, and he'd make me sit like this for hours and hours while he, you know, tried new lights and lenses. So it's kind of a little bit sadistic that I became a photographer and I do this to BJ. This is the small town I grew up in. It was really isolated. There was nothing to do, but luckily the George Eastman house was close by. So I fell in love with the history of photography and I became deeply interested in like looking back through the whole trajectory of the medium. And I feel like that's really informed my work, like analyzing the medium itself. And in the bookstore, I found a very inspiring monograph of Man Ray's work, and it made me want to have friends like his. So my whole life, I've been thinking about like building a world or finding a community, or even like playing around with gender and reality itself, inspired by this work. And you can see Barbette and Marcel Duchamp as you know, playing with gender here in the 1920s, and just seeing that really opened my eyes and stuck with me. And this is from my first roll of film. I started photographing my 10-year-old sister as if she was one of my surrealist buddies, and I would dress up all of my friends this way and play make believe like surrealist dress up when I was like 15. And so this is BJ's childhood.
Yeah, so I'm from Sleepy Hollow, New York, which is outside New York City, and I had a pretty kind of classic. Oh my God, there's a turkey walking by outside our window. Sorry.
We're out in the countryside.
Its head was going like that, like right in front of me. So I kind of had like a classic middle class childhood out in Sleepy Hollow. There's a lot of colonial history out there, which I didn't realize was going to shape my life. I was just kind of vaguely aware of it. We like to show this picture of me and my sister because when we were kids, we were basically looked exactly the same. And were dressed the same and had the same affect. And then you kind of hit puberty and the whole world explodes and we all go through that. But what's the next slide? Okay, we're gonna jump straight to college. I feel like I used to say something about high school in this lecture, but what's the need? So I kind of came late to gender experimentation. It wasn't a part of my life when I was younger. And I like to stress that because I think that there's a lot, it's getting better for sure. Everything's getting better just in terms of representation and how people talk about gender. It's like every year we give this lecture, it's like the world is like getting better on this stuff, but there's still a pretty strong narrative of kind of like the trans narrative of like, I was 4 and I was wearing my mother's dresses like in the closet, this kind of like innate thing that therefore it should start really, really young. And I found that that wasn't my experience and that's not a lot of people's experiences. But I definitely did have this kind of like feeling of confusion and consternation, which again, I think is pretty universal for people who are, whether you're kind of, as you grow up and start to express your gender, it's not easy for anyone, which is something that kind of threads through our work together too. But when I got to college, I started really dressing as a woman full time, and I went to Wesleyan, which is like a very liberal college, and I started really leaning into it. And then I graduated and got spit out into New York City and was like, now what do I do? Like, I'm not in this super accepting liberal space. And I had a job, I worked in an office, and it's not that they weren't wonderful, accepting people who would have really probably been fine if I showed up in a dress and accepted that, but it wasn't a space of experimentation. It wasn't a space for experimentation. And I wasn't ready to be out of that. I hadn't figured out what the hell was going on with my body and with my identity yet. And so that's kind of like where I was in my life when I met Lissa and when our project started. And I think it does kind of help set the scene for the exploration that we both went on.
So we both met at the Museum of the City of New York. So outside of photography, I've never done commercial work. I've always worked in museums and collections and as a researcher and more of a story producer. But what was really fantastic about working at the City Museum was their Broadway Theater archive, which included the photos of Carl Van Vechten, who explored communities of African-American artists, queer artists in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. So finding these ancestors has become extremely important to my process. And BJ at the same time was finding these ancestors as well within the archive. And that's how we connected together as friends first. So I'll let BJ speak about Jenny June.
Yeah, so Jenny June is someone who I consider an American icon, slowly getting the recognition that they deserve. And I kind of found her or his works or their works when I was working on this exhibition about New York City, and we were looking for different people who could, represent different aspects of New York City history. And Jenny June was basically the first advocate for what we now think of as trans rights, at least in the United States, whose work was published and survived, has survived for us to read. And they published a couple of books through kind of niche medical presses that basically talked about their life as a gender nonconforming person. They call themselves an androgen. And their experience creating community in New York City, and also the violence they faced, and stories of murder, stories of assault for her friends, and then basically argued that these people should be accorded rights and respect, and that it's normal what they were doing for them. And then what I love is that Jenny June in these books was really interested in finding art historical precedent for being, again, what we now call trans, although that language didn't exist, and then posed themselves in different poses from classical history, which I think is really inspiring and shows how important, how much art history and gender expression have kind of entwined, even from a very, very early moment in this country's history, or in our modern history, looking at gender. And I didn't set this up as well as I usually do when I talk about Jenny June, but I like to show this slide to kind of get, in combination with Jenny June's life, to kind of get at the idea of gender as a constructed thing and some different ways to think of that, as we look at our work, which is all about different ways of constructing gender or portraying gender, unfixing gender. So someone like Jenny June, lived before a time when medical transition was a possibility, and kind of had to deal with a different sort of reality around gender because of that. And they chose to really inhabit both female and male roles. And you could see, in how they presented themselves, there were aspects of their self-presentation or times when they were presenting very much as a woman, as Jenny June, and there were other times when they were saying, well, I'm also Earl Lind, and which is also probably is not their actual name that was on their birth certificate, but I'm also Earl Lind, this sort of masculine figure who's calling on different kinds of professional authority. And the two personas were kind of interacting. So this illustration comes from a history of the body called The Expressiveness of the Body, and it shows two early modern, which is my time period as a historian, depictions of the human body, one from Western Europe and one from China. And you can see they're very, very different. And I like to show it because one of the many things that this book points out about the difference between Western conceptions and depictions of the body and traditional Chinese medical conceptions of the body is that Chinese doctors, in examining the body over the course of hundreds of years and building their realm of knowledge, never came up with a word for muscle, and they didn't see muscles. And you could see in this portrait, they're not looking at muscles, they're looking at acupuncture points, and they're looking at the body in a different way. And so I like to just pose this kind of thought experiment of like, what is a muscle? And does a muscle really have existence outside of the fact that a doctor could cut open a body and say, this is a muscle? Like, is a muscle a thing in our body, or is a muscle a way of talking about the body? And that's kind of how I think about gender. Like, people tend to think of gender as a fixed trait, and I like to think of gender more as like a way of talking about the body. And I can imagine a human society that didn't have gender pretty easily to me. And we'd have the same bodies and we'd do different things, but you just wouldn't use that language, and then it wouldn't exist, even though you'd still be humans. And something would be there, like the thing beneath the concept of muscle somehow. But sorry, I'm like rambling a little.
No, you're great. So I also, talking about process, like to give a little background is what I'm thinking about when I'm making images, or what I'm thinking about when I look at images, because I never look at an image and see its surface. I'm always looking at the desire within it. Every image is like a message, it's a language and a longing from the person who made it to communicate with others. And I like to show the Mona Lisa in this presentation because It's the most reproduced painting in history. And it's quite fascinating that it was stolen in 1918, back when newspapers were, first able to reproduce photographs. So it was widely reproduced all over the world because of this famous theft. And then now, as you see, like that familiarity, that repetition made people feel like it was famous or the most beautiful or most desired or somehow extremely special. But perhaps it was just because they saw it over and over again. And I think about beauty that way and representation of accepted forms of self-expression in society. And I've always been drawn, like I said, to the surrealists, and especially this postcard where Marcel Duchamp intervened by drawing a little mustache on the Mona Lisa and writing LHOOQ or LHOOQ, which sounds like in French, there's fire down below, or she has like a hot butt. So I just like the kind of the commentary on this kind of reproduction and the construction of value and image. So I also, working in the Broadway Theater Archive, I really love these early cabinet card photographs that were sold outside theaters in the 19th century. So this is Lillian Russell, who was the Kim Kardashian of the 19th century. And you can see how she used a very provocative image, like building her image, using the press, using the repetition of her name to build recognition and familiarity. And that really launched this whole new identity and desire in society. And I actually am very fascinated by Kim Kardashian, the way that her unrelenting and confident portrayal of her image, which wasn't the norm at the time, but just presenting it over and over again, despite controversy or even provoking controversy, to multiply her image again, and how that's affected the human body globally through people manipulating their image through Photoshop and makeup and plastic surgery. Repetition is extremely powerful. And I'm always looking at the language of fashion and the language of beauty that gets passed down, and sometimes even the subversion of gender that gets passed down through generations. So you can see at the top left, male impersonators from the 19th century, and then actresses and celebrities from the 20s and 30s. There's Anna May Wong, Josephine Baker, Marlene Dietrich, and then in the 1960s, Brigitte Bardot, kind of like passing on this really potent, like sexually provocative performance, and using that throughout history to kind of remind people of this thing that happened before and signify this kind of action and this kind of performance. And I always love kind of really feeling my desire after I watch film. So the experience of, let's say, watching, this is Brigitte Bardot in Godard's Contempt. So watching a powerful and incredibly constructed image or story, and then afterwards wanting to be that, having it affect your dinner conversation. An image can be so powerful, it can affect your whole life. You might be so drawn to a beautiful image that you want to become it. You might buy a new eyeliner or something, wear it for a week, and then, it's really funny how beauty and imagery can really change a person. And I always think about how photography has created this explosion, especially now with social media, of identity representation. Like before, communities would copy other individuals within a community, and then there would be a localized kind of way of dressing or a set of norms for how to look. And now it's changing every second as you scroll through your iPhone or whatever phone you use. And these images are drawn, are they're very tied to a time period. So you can see Twiggy in 1964. She was discovered in a hair salon, and then they, the media, the magazine companies created this image to represent what they wanted to sell from the 1960s, what they thought, what they wanted people to desire, and what they saw people desiring with the changing of society and the economy at that time. And these ideals that were represented in these powerful images, like maybe being quite thin, not, being at that point of adolescence where you're more androgynous, or maybe more free of responsibility, or creating the teenagehood for the first time. All these different things are wrapped up in this image. And you can see from 1964 to 1966, that construction. And then here in 2011, a magazine cover where it's referenced. And then I really love YouTube makeup tutorials where people become whoever they want through makeup and through costume and through the construction of the image. Another thing that many people don't realize, it's that window that's making the light, is that the earliest color or early color films that were produced by Technicolor with the Technicolor film process, the director of the company, the founder of the company, his wife, who they actually became separated, she had some kind of very strict contract where she was the advisor to the color palette of hundreds and hundreds of films from that classic era of Hollywood cinema. So she actually decided and controlled what colors looked like in like Singing in the Rain, or all these like fantastic and brightly colored and just, just very provocative and exciting films. So color was considered a feminine talent and not necessarily a masculine talent. So I think about that a lot. I think about color a lot and what that means. Like at Walt Disney Studios, the men were the illustrators. They would draw and create the characters, and women were the ones who knew more about color. So they were in another department and they would paint all of the cells for the animation. So just knowing that in the back of my head. And also just, I think a lot about early fashion photography and a lot of the photographers who were coming out of, were fleeing from, Nazi occupation in Germany, or queer people like Cecil Beaton who were, experimenting with building themselves and self-creation in the 30s and the 40s. And these are the images that were in fashion magazines that women looked at. People coming out of war, people coming out of queer spaces, creating images that we still repeat today. They're in the DNA of who we are, from what we look at. And I also think about photo students, or being a photographer myself, or being an artist, and how familiarity affects what I capture. We all have, anyone who's picked up a camera for the first time, it's very unpleasant to create an image that looks nothing like images that were seen before, to create something that's really different than things that have been approved of before by critics or by, collectors or art museums. And you can see this in, you just want to create the things that you love, that made you feel so good when you first saw it. So there's like Douglas Sirk with All That Heaven Allows, an amazing film from the 1950s. And you could see Fassbinder here in the 1970s, like directly referencing this Douglas Sirk's melodramas, because it becomes this passed down language. You don't just kind of start from nothing. And a lot of it comes from desire and love of the beauty of experiencing whatever emotion that is like provoked by the art that came before. And you could see here below still photographer Philip Lorga de Corsia in 2000. I'm just so interested how these things are passed down. And I never for a second when I'm making work fool myself into thinking I'm going to do anything original. All I want to do is like totally indulge myself by just making things that are a total collage and a total like collection of everything I love without any kind of discretion, more than just me doing what I want to do, because that's what drives me. I think the biggest influence for me is probably Kenneth Anger and Puce Moment, a short film, if you could look it up, it's about 7 minutes long, is so much about like desire and photography and queer desire, and how color and texture and fabric in the history of cinema like can be so erotic. So actually I showed this film to BJ before we made our first pictures that same day. So we'll go into our actual work. So sorry about that. Thank you for bearing with us. So these are the first pictures that we actually took. And yeah, BJ came over and we had a lot of like lunchtime discussions at work about existential crises and like what we wanted and the idea. We really talked a lot about like, what if we just like tore our lives apart and built it from scratch using photography, but we weren't really like in touch with our feelings for each other. But then when we took these pictures, on the left, it's just a test photo of myself. And then on the right, it's BJ. You can see it sucks. Like these photos are not good. They're wrinkled fabric and they're just taken in front of a mirror with the cheapest materials and a bad camera. But we just had to get started. And then just seeing the images, even though they're not perfect, was like this, it was this like epiphany, like, hey, we can do this. Like there's something here. And I showed some of my friends and everyone said these photos are not well made and you shouldn't do this and this is stupid. And I was like, I don't care. So then for a while we didn't know what to do and if we could have this. So we kept those photos in our phones and kind of looked at them on our lunch breaks and stuff. And then BJ made this locket for Christmas for me. And we kind of kept this secret of like this possibility of making something, of building a relationship that had our own gender dynamics that we created, that we decided from scratch, and trying to be as creative as possible and to create a world that was, you know, experiential and also through imagery. And then when we finally allowed ourselves to be together, we were just going crazy. We went insane. Like we were just photographing every single day. BJ had not gone to art school, so I told him it was normal to do photo shoots all weekend, every weekend. And like he never even complained. And we were like, you know, just digging through my closet, finding scraps of fabric and just not worrying about like, oh, is this large format color film? Is this, is this that? Like just kind of going for it and not letting that hold me back. Because I'm very inspired by outsider art. And that's a lot of, you know, that's work by people who aren't in the, you know, the mainstream conversation of art history. And if they can make things that I love, then I thought maybe we could. So you can see like there's just this excitement, like what does BJ look like when he takes his shirt off? Like what's the in-between moment? What's this? This is BJ with a fever at the bottom. Like what does BJ look like with a fever? You didn't even have shoes back then, like only sneakers, not like heels or anything like that. So kind of building a wardrobe. So everything was happening. Like this is my bathing suit looked better on you than it did on me.
Not true.
Looked way better. It looks way better on you. And just kind of going for it and not worrying, just going for it and doing it for ourselves and not really showing anyone. No one likes, I mean, I've had people not want to publish this or terrible comments because the armpit hair. So if you don't like armpit hair, like just look at this armpit hair. And then you see here too, like my little comment on male impersonation and that like amazing imagery. And if you can see any like Marlene Dietrich films with the director Joseph von Sternberg, I highly recommend it, especially The Devil is a Woman. But you can see there's just playfulness, and this is really good because this kind of shows the idea of the mirror. And I'm really interested in people trying to see themselves, and how when you see social media or selfies, or when you see Facebook images, you're kind of not seeing what the person is showing, but you're seeing what the person wants you to see. So you're seeing this other thing, but and in this image, this is like my makeup mirror that I used to use. You can see that the mirror is very distorted. Like one half of BJ's face looks very different than the other. And every lens, like if you've ever FaceTimed on your phone, like it's like a nightmare. Every lens can like make or break your self-esteem, at least for me. Ruin your day. I don't know, like, because you can never see yourself. You're dependent on mirrors, you're dependent on lenses, you're dependent on people around you. But there's this great desire to have people love you and to think you're beautiful and to want you, because it's natural, it's biological. So this image for me really represents that struggle of, what Lacan explored in the mirror phase. I'm talking too much. Do you want to say anything?
No.
I'm just gonna flip through these. That's the first time I was in the photos. So I'm just gonna flip through these. So you can see that it started out with just discount store fabrics. These are ecclesiastical fabrics. So I went to a place where like priests get their clothes to make their outfits. I like that. They have really good fabrics. This is BJ's parents' house, and BJ's parents didn't know we were doing this. And then we just kind of like went all over the house, like while they were away on vacation, taking pictures. And then this is when we started traveling on location. So I was trying to find like a ubiquitous motel, because even before, like, this is very Cindy Sherman, but I was kind of like looking at, like even before that, how women are always shown in hotels. And it's like this idea that a woman is becoming independent, going outside of the home. They're on the road, but they're also probably going to get murdered soon. So this one, I was thinking a lot of Frances Farmer, this actress from the 1940s, who was really brilliant. And she identified as a communist. So then the media kind of destroyed her, and she ended up dealing with a lot of terrible mental illness. So I was thinking about Frances Farmer here and the idea of like women being punished for their independence.
I also like to chime in here and just like take a moment to point out the incredible like behind the scenes work that goes into a lot of these images on Lissa's part, because I think that when we decided we wanted to take this photo, Lissa looked at like online listings and photos of every motel between New York City and like North Carolina on the East Coast, like thousands of hotels, and finally found the hotel that was right, that hadn't been renovated, that was like right. And we get there, and it's in Virginia, and the owner had actually just passed away like the week before, and he'd been running the hotel since the 50s. But we persuaded the woman at the front desk to let us stay anyway. They weren't really taking reservations. And then after all this incredible work, the main photo we got from all this just only shows the bedspread. But nonetheless, I feel like, I mean, for me, it was kind of like, really? But that level of thought and care kind of goes into every photo and creates this incredible feeling of layers that kind of gets added to all the layers of references that Lissa has been telling you about, that I think is an important part of how the photos get put together.
I also just like go online too much, probably looking at clothes in hotels. So yeah, like I'm really sensitive to color. Like I could look at every purple dress on eBay, like 40,000 or something purple dresses to find the exact right color and fabric. That I feel like is reflecting whatever my desire is. So we've been doing this work since like 2014, and it's kind of just like almost like a documentary of what kinds of velvet I like, you know, or like what, I don't know, like what color green is driving me crazy, you know, or, you know, like with BJ too, like we watch films all the time together and we just kind of want to be in them. So then we go inside of them. So we started going to more and more elaborate spaces. So this is in Umbria. It's like a house that's 800 years old in Italy. And we just kind of lived there and just kind of like felt the way, like the stone floors in this house were kind of, what's the word for it? They were indented.
Worn down.
They're worn down by people walking back and forth for 800 years throughout this space. And just, I really think about the domestic space and how it's so associated with femininity, and thinking about Disney movies or fairy tales where women are kind of, they're stuck within that domestic space. They're stuck within this small square footage. And then in order to escape, it's usually through clothing. Like Cinderella has a glass slipper, like the prince totally doesn't recognize her till she has the shoe on, or they like kind of like weave some golden fabric or something. Like you have to kind of sew something that's like really fabulous, so someone kind of spots you who's in a different class and helps you escape, and you have to be very good and perfect to stay there. So this underwear is from Amazon.com. So that one, I don't know. But I really like this one because it was in the New York Times and on a billboard. And I just like that, not because it was like published, but because everyone saw it. And I really like the idea of creating an image that like makes everyone question like what their desire is, like makes maybe heteronormative guys question themselves, or makes everyone kind of like question what they desire when they desire something. Is it the signifiers, or is it the repetition of image, or, you know, what is it? And I feel like that does that for me. So I'll just like go through. Yeah, so then we went to, this is where we are now. So at the time I was really thinking about California. We moved here recently. And thinking about Hollywood and thinking about like that image factory, and like I, you know, watching documentaries about RKO studios and the kind of power dynamics, which you could see like in a movie like David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, something like that, and kind of going to this space of, you know, very potent self-creation. A lot of the earliest film stars, they were coming from vaudeville. They weren't necessarily rich. A lot of them were escaping like very harsh lives, and they were able to create such beauty and desire. And now it's like, it's easy to forget that past, but there's always these complicated stories when you look at that early history. So this is more 60s though. So you can see we're in Palm Springs. I was really into Priscilla Presley. That's why we went to Palm Springs, because she has such an incredible image. Like when you look up Priscilla, like Elvis really wanted her to be wearing heavy makeup, big hair, little baby doll dresses, and then also to be a virgin at the same time. I picked her up when she was like 15, put her in his Hollywood Regency Bizarro house in Graceland and kind of kept her in there. And she had the most desired man like on the planet, and then they couldn't consummate their relationship. And when they did, he didn't like her as much anymore. At least that's the narrative. And then, I don't know, I just love all the contradictions within that. And the idea of like achieving beauty and achieving this kind of like desired level of femininity or self-expression, and then having it imprison you at the same time. So having wealth, having material goods, achieving this standard of beauty, and then having it be a total like weapon at the same time. Like a lot of people, like they care about BJ and BJ's story and who BJ is. But if I was a man showing pictures of my girlfriend looking beautiful, no one would care about her. No one would question if she was intelligent. No one would care if she was think that she would be getting her PhD or had a voice, because we're really trained by like tabloids or etc. to have a kind of animosity and also fervent desire for feminine beauty. And it's really wild, actually. And this, I think about Larry Sultan's mom. That's another reason why I wanted to go to Palm Springs. I think that's where his parents lived. And there's that amazing photo, which I should put in this slide presentation, of his mother in this like perfect suburban house that seems precisely decorated, and she must have very expensive clothing on, all very desired labels, and yet her husband's completely ignoring her and watching TV. So having all these things that signify achievement, and then at the same time like it being completely empty. And then I was like, what if I had an experience of being like a man and having a wife and being so cold? Like, what would that be like? So we did that. Yeah, I was thinking about Sharon Tate here.
You're good.
Okay, I thought you were telling me to stop talking. I don't know. This came from like a fetish video on YouTube. I really love fetish videos on YouTube that are about like plastic or something, or balloons or weird things like that that you can't censor. So there is like someone who is really into plastic raincoats on YouTube. And then you want to talk about this? This is our newer work. You just click there.
Yeah. So the new project is called Silence of Spaces, and it's kind of like, we kind of pushed the work a long way, and we were kind of thinking about different directions to move in. And we discovered this very strange space in upstate New York. It had been it had been a Catholic seminary originally. It was built as a Catholic seminary, and after the Catholic Church's ability to recruit priests, this is important, it was a seminary high school, which I think is just mind-blowing. This meant that you decided to become a priest in middle school, and then you went to seminary high school, right? And it was full of people right up until the peak enrollment with hundreds of students was in the early 60s. And then in the mid 60s, around the same time that Twiggy was being invented in our other body of work, the Catholic Church, it just collapsed. The whole thing collapsed. People stopped wanting to be priests. Middle schoolers stopped saying, hey, I'll go to seminary high school and become a priest. And
sexual revolution.
Yeah. And so the building went through all these different purposes. It was never completely abandoned, which meant that it just kept accreting new purposes and people who couldn't quite maintain everything as they tried to make it into, part of it was a public school for a few years in the 70s. Then it was a spa. It eventually came under the ownership of a kind of like culty evangelical
cults and stuff. But so much of it was like about gender, like the idea of like young men coming together and not being around women because it was too, like they're studying to be priests, but also like it would have been too tempting to sin.
Yeah, it was an all-male environment.
So an all-male environment, and the idealism of that, and the idea of that being a more pure space, and also the sexuality of that, like thinking of all these young guys together, like, I don't know, in a building. And then later on it was like a summer camp for young girls to learn about how to maintain their virginity until marriage. It was really creepy. There was so much creepy stuff left in there, but we're kind of just absorbing that energy and looking at the history of religion, how it relates to gender, and how that's so deeply, whether or not you're religious, it's just so deeply embedded in our culture, this idea of shame around one's sexuality or one's body. And I always think about that too, like when I'm in the photos, like how my breasts are so much more shameful in society than BJ's chest. Like the photos of BJ without a shirt don't get kicked off Instagram. And then my body, like I would have to cover up, and thinking about that. And I always think that BJ looks much better than me. And
That's not true.
I just feel that way.
It's not true.
So BJ is kind of like this, you know, like it's always my ideal. So you can see here, like we're just kind of exploring this space, yeah, and exploring the body and exploring, like, you know, even the androgyny of course, Jesus, like looking at early paintings and the kind of sexuality of like Christian and Catholic art. And also the sexuality of denying sexuality. Even like to be asexual is a sexuality, or to forbid sexuality is a very potent expression of sexuality. So I started doing videos actually. When I finally show this work for real, I'm gonna have videos. So you can see. And there were like religious retreats happening at the same time when we're here, so we're sneaking around. I was so scared that someone was gonna get angry. They probably would have gotten very angry if they saw us. And I was thinking a lot about like vestments, like priest vestments, and then how theatrical and feminine they are. So then this is like, we rented costumes that used to be used for the New York City Opera. So this is a huge cape. And then at the bottom, I went to a thrift store nearby and I got 12 Infant of Prague statues, which are these little statues of baby Jesus, like totally dressed in drag, like the most blinged out capes and jewels and furs and everything. And then I don't know, they're in my apartment and then someone's subletting it right now. So it must be so scary for them. And this is like the bathroom where all the guys like took showers in these weird foot baths together, which is very non-sexual. This is another robe, which is pretty. This is the pink room. And then, I don't know, sometimes I talk about my job because a lot of people think that you should always just, be an artist totally and never have a job. But then I've always had jobs. And I always explore similar ideas through my work. So this is Juan Jose Barboza Gubo and Andrew Mosek Cannon. So they did these beautiful images documenting the trans community in Peru. And I was able to show this work at the museum and really kind of like explore a lot of my things I really believe in, like just like the rights of all people, and in terms of like sexual freedom and like the drive to kind of release people of shame for having thoughts. I really believe in that. So this is a show I did on Leonora Feeney, which was amazing because as I said, I was like kind of obsessed with the surrealists. And then I was able to do the first ever US show on Feeney, who didn't identify as a woman. And she really showed these like incredible images of sexual desire that were unusual at the time. So blah, blah, blah. I don't know if you want to see this. Okay. So how do we stop sharing screen? Okay. Thank you for bearing with us.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I will pass things over to Todd. And for the rest of our audience, definitely be thinking about the questions that you want to ask.
Thank you both for that wonderful presentation. Sorry, Heather, were you going to say something, or are you just like queuing yourself up? Okay, cool. That was so wonderful. I've been totally obsessed with your photography since we did a program in the fall. I'm deeply interested in all of the things that you're talking about, and that's in part because my own scholarship is on early 20th century literature, art, and film. So all of these references are just deeply boiling in me. So I'm going to try and limit myself to a couple of questions here and let other people have a chance. But I was really interested in thinking about the question of repetition that you thought about, the repetition of the image, especially as it relates to us thinking about what's normal, what's normative, what's possible. And I was thinking of Christine Jorgensen a little bit too, as a kind of reference that isn't from the same period and relates deeply, I think, to your work. And I'll just give a little bit of background. So Christine Jorgensen was a woman who fought during World War II in Europe and stayed there after the war ended, went to Denmark and got gender affirmation surgery, returned to the United States, and was sort of the first person who was publicly known for having gender affirmation surgery. And she traveled around and toured America in this kind of post-war moment that's a really conservative moment around gender, a kind of return to femininity, a kind of return to the nuclear family. It's the moment of the Lavender Scare. But there was this real deep interest in her. She had lots of photographs taken of her. She had acting roles. She just toured and did shows. And I'm really interested in a moment when there's another kind of turn to conservatism in thinking about gender, thinking about all of the kind of transphobic laws that are being passed, all of the kinds of transphobic policies, the rhetoric that's going around. How do you think about your art in this question of repetition and representation fitting into this, the kind of like moment of a transphobic moment, a kind of conservative moment around gender increasingly?
Well, I feel like I could just imagine with Christine, like what a guiding light just seeing pictures of her must have been to people who had that secret. She was a total icon, and what she really revealed, I mean, she really had a look that was very much the normative look of popular look at the time. I mean, she was blonde with a tiny little nose and was, you know, very proud and fashionable. So, you know, she caught attention that way by using those techniques, like the techniques of beauty. And I think that, you know, with our work, what I was really interested in is making the images that would maybe slip back into the media somehow. And when we first released it, it really did. And there was a lot of hateful comment on some of the articles about our work, but they saw it nonetheless. And it's quite fascinating how sometimes when we have exhibits, people who I would read as being conservative at first, like for instance, Newport, Rhode Island, these women who identified as Republicans, like were really into the work. They, you know, it was kind of like a bridge somehow. So I think that, yeah, like using repetition or creating images that fit and don't fit to kind of subvert whatever's happening in the media. Like I think about that, like kind of inserting little, like, yeah, like little, go for it.
I think I think also that one of the things that Lissa's doing is making photos that are really, because of the way they're drawing on things that people already love or things that people have loved in the past or seen before, and because they're so carefully constructed, that a kind of phenomenon happens where people love the photo before they realize what it's a photo of. And I think that there's a little bit of subversive potential in that too. And I've kind of seen that happen actually just in person when the art is on the walls and people walk by and their first reaction is kind of like, oh, I love this photo. And their second reaction is like, wait a minute, do I love this photo? Like,
Or is
am I
that
comfortable with
a
this?
man?
Yeah.
Is that a man?
Yeah,
I don't
thank
really
you.
care as long as they look at it.
I think it's really interesting. I'm thinking about it just because of this law in North Carolina that's all about like scrutinizing children or people up to the age of 21 for signs of gender nonconformity, and the way in which that asks people to like survey other people's bodies. And I think your work really powerfully asks people to do that for a different reason, right? It's asking people to like find some kind of pleasure and desire in it. So another thing that I wanted to ask about, and then we'll open the floor, is the question of class. You talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but often when people are doing drag or playing up, dressing up in women's clothes, they are often doing drag across class as well. There's a kind of long legacy of not only playing with gender, but also playing with the potential of being somebody who's in a different and higher class than you are. And I'd be interested in hearing more about the way that you sometimes are talking about luxury and the kind of like richness of material and the desire that you have for space and for particular scenes and settings and particular garments.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up lower middle class, but I've always been like a finder. Like I grew up in Salvation Armies and like thrift stores and stuff like that, because in garage sales. So part of like constructing the images is kind of making it appear like we have more wealth. So like a lot of these beautiful dresses, I get them quite cheap actually, and they're just completely shredded in the back and they only look good in photographs, or else we rent temporarily like a beautiful home, but we don't live there. We just kind of are playing dress up. So, and then it takes a lot of time, like to find these things like that once had a much higher value, like to be able to afford them takes quite a lot more patience to go to flea markets and stuff like that, and to kind of like hunt and hunt. And it also shows like how value is ephemeral. Like some of these dresses might have been extremely expensive, and then now they're worth $10. So yeah, I think about that a lot, like wanting it to look like we're super fancy, but we're not in real life.
Awesome. Well, I know that Heather had her hand raised, but I want to let everyone know that if you'd like to type your question in the chat, I can read it for you. Or if you'd like to raise your hand and ask it yourself, just feel free to unmute after I call on you when your hand is raised. So I'll start off with Heather.
So I'm going to be honest, that was actually me trying to do the clap sign.
Oh.
But I hit the wrong button. But I do actually have a question, and I realized it's something I've actually been thinking about since we first acquired your images at the Trout Gallery. And that was, I started to wonder how your work might be perceived by audiences outside the West, where perhaps there were cultural norms of beauty that were different. And one of the things I started to wonder about I wondered if there would be a tendency to sort of translate the concepts to whatever the cultural norms of beauty were, or if they would be unreadable. And I was just curious if you've had feedback or responses from maybe viewers who grew up with very different sort of cultural standards of beauty.
I have an answer, but you can go.
Oh, you go.
I feel like it was really interesting in the kind of first round and biggest round of kind of press activity to see the international press and articles being written in other languages, and also the way the images kind of circulate on blogs and things. Like there was someone, was it in Chile, where the person wrote like this whole long story about our lives in Spanish that had nothing to do with.
Yeah, they said
anything.
like I threw a lamp at BJ and stuff like that.
Very, very
In a fake
dramatic.
interview.
Very dramatic fake interview. The work has been, posted online in East Asia. I think that, I mean, it's very hard for us to know, of course. But I do think it's complicated because of the way that, especially the fashion imagery and the Hollywood imagery is really a global export within the context of like an American empire in the 20th century. And actually it's a huge part of American empire, and the way that these images have circulated, our predecessor images have circulated around the world and certainly would be familiar. I mean, I assume that most young Americans now probably have never seen a Marlene Dietrich movie. But when everyone in America knew who Marlene Dietrich was, a lot of people not in America saw those movies too. Everyone saw those movies. And so it's something that is really interesting to us, but we haven't sort of examined it fully, certainly.
Yeah, I got some interesting emails. Like someone from Japan said that they were using the images in a campaign for men's rights to wear dresses and stuff, and boys' rights to wear dresses and things like that, which was nice. It's been shown it's popped up in different places, and I don't know I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think the colonial element is really interesting as well. Thank you.
Clara, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about your artistic process when you make images, I guess how you go from idea to final product, like specifically when you go in, do you have like a clear vision of what you want the final image to be, or do you more like respond to the space as you go?
I definitely like come up with like a base, a database almost of references that I'm most interested in exploring at the time. And then I build a wardrobe around it and I search for locations. But you don't really know what the location is going to be till you get there. So I bring quite a lot of garments and then just try to stay in the place, like living there day and night.
It always blows my mind how incredibly intensive and detailed the preparation is, and at the same time how like nothing is decided ahead of time and it's completely spontaneous. Like you think there would be one or the other, either you plan a lot or it's super spontaneous, but actually you plan a lot and then it's super spontaneous.
Yeah, you always have to improvise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. You've used the term construction quite a bit, and that's quite evident in the nature of the images. And it makes me think of any art making process, particularly if you go back with paintings where you have oftentimes drawings, compositional drawings, a variety of studies that lead up to a painting. But ultimately, what goes on the canvas is entire artifice. Would you comment on the nature of photography in a way of constructing images? Because you're sort of treating it almost like a set. You're using clothing and costume and you're creating an image. But unlike a painting, the photograph actually for a moment did exist in time for a split second in just the way that we see it, which is different than a fully constructed artifice of a painting. How does photography fit into your world in terms of construction? Because it does exist in time, even if for only a 60th of a second.
Well, I think it has to do with the montage of, like I said, the space, the whatever design elements in the space, the carpet, the architecture, the furniture, the clothing, the makeup, all these different things. Or, you know, the one of Frances Farmer was just as much about Sissy Spacek in the 1970s. I think that I'm fully aware when things are not seamless in terms of it being like true to a period. So in that sense, I feel like it's kind of a collage of all these different things that I find or that BJ and I find attractive all at the same time.
I want to jump in on that question too, because I would maybe challenge that idea that the photograph is representing something that actually existed for a 60th of a second. I think that to the extent that the photo is representing a reflection that existed for a 60th of a second on a camera, like on a mirror inside of a box or on a whatever it is inside of a digital camera that collects the data. Yeah, but from the perspective of the model in the photo, there is no moment in this process where what I go through feels anything like the final product that's being created. And so I think that that's something to maybe think about, because the model's perspective isn't usually included, although I think that, any number of models and views from throughout art history, it's really hard work and you have to learn how to be photographed, and they have contributed a lot throughout art history. But yeah, I think that when you're actually in that space, the moment of the photo doesn't exist, not really, not only inside the camera maybe, is what I would say.
Do we have any other questions? I know we had some comments in the chat just saying this is wonderfully informative and that Emily loves the vibrant and beautiful colors. There were some seconds of that. Lisa, would you like to ask your question?
Lisa, I think you're muted.
All right, sorry about that. This is for BJ. It's a very non-academic question. What is it like to be amused? What is it like to be photographed all the time, knowing that you're being looked at, that your picture's going out into the world? I mean, what does that do to you and your self-image? And do you like what you see, or are you critical of it, or are you not concerned about the final image and you're just involved in the process?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Now it feels almost just like a normal part of my life. Like, what, everyone doesn't do this? But if you'd asked the question 5 years ago, I would have been like, yeah, the first time you walk into a room and you're like on the wall 24 times, it's strange. It's very disorienting. I certainly do enjoy how I'm portrayed in the photos. I love the joint exploration we do, and as we've been talking about this whole time, so much of this is drawing on things we both love, and also things, a lot of things that I wasn't aware of. I wasn't really aware of visual culture or movies or kind of underground queer culture in a visual way. I was on the academic side reading, very wordy, complicated books about queer theory, and seeing how there's a whole nother way to approach those kinds of issues non-verbally was totally mind-blowing to me. Oh my God, what's his name? Peace Moment guy. The Kenneth Anger films that we talked about earlier. I mean, I couldn't overstate how mind-blowing it was to see those movies for the first time for me, like intellectually and emotionally. In terms of like the experience of being a model, it's really just a craft or a skill, and I have to learn how to do it. And you spend a lot of time looking at other people who are posing for photographs and looking at photos in a different way. And I went to the Met and I looked at sculptures and looked at poses and trying to understand that. The way something feels, and this kind of goes to the last question too, the way something feels, what feels natural and what looks natural in a photo are not related to each other. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand when they're looking at photos, that like to look like I'm just naturally just happen to just collapse onto the couch perfectly and I'm just relaxing. Like actually I'm like, everything is bent the wrong way, and like I'm like shaking as soon as Lissa is done taking photos because my muscles are all, and I think that's mean, that's what modeling is for everyone who does it. It's a very demanding job, and it's a skill, and it's really bringing something to the table that isn't always recognized, especially because it's work that's usually done by women, certainly in Western art history. That's how it's done.
Let's see. Paula, are you raising your hand?
I couldn't find, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't find the one that, the real one. Well, this is the real one. My husband Holt and I, we live in Virginia, and we read the New York Times, and that's when we were first exposed to my beautiful boyfriend photos. And I just wanted to say we have a wall in our apartment in Richmond that features different artists and photographs, and we just change it out. There are 21 frames, and we change it out periodically. And we just keep going back to your beautiful art. And we have lots of family. Between us, we have 13 grandchildren. And it's just been a wonderful topic for us to have in our home. And, we'll just, sometimes we look at each other and say, okay, what are we doing next? And then we say, okay, we're going back to my beautiful boyfriend. And I have a nephew who's transgender, and I feel in some ways it's been special to her to have the art there and to honor her, and for our family members, especially my 94-year-old father is very accepting. But just to have it has meant so much to us. And I just wanted to mention that this evening. We were very excited we could get online with y'all and share your story and listen to your story.
Thank
you so much.
That
That's
means
so
so. That's like the most important thing, like that I could ever get out of this. So
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That means so much to us. Thank you.
Okay, I will unmute now. Or mute now.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. What a wonderful note to end on. If there are no more questions, I don't see any other hands raised. Well, I just want to thank Lissa and BJ. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to Todd Nordgren and LGBTQ Services who collaborated with us for this event. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Lissa and BJ.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.